It's a sideline purely because my daughter wound up there after she got married. So from 2004 to 2011, about which time I stopped traveling, I've been going almost every year to Australia. And when I go to a place, and whenever I visited cities abroad over the years, it's been looking at places off the beaten track, events off the beaten track, happenings off the beaten track, rather than what the tourist brochures tell you all about. When I came back to Madras after each trip, I wrote in the Sunday Hindu several articles. My Hindu column, Madras Miscellany, carried other pieces collected over the years, not necessarily from these travels, but with connection with Australia. And Madras Musings has also carried material. Much of this material really goes back quite a long time, in the sense that my connection with Australia, in a very vague sort of way, goes back even before David was born. It goes back to the 1930s and between 1930s and then just after the war, when every time England went to Australia, or Australia came to England to play the Test of the Ashes series, they would stop off for a one-day match in Colombo. And that was the high Australia. Those days I used to cheer for Australia. Nowadays I get around to cheering for India occasionally. But ever since then I've been interested in Australia. Many of my friends and colleagues, especially from the times of Ceylon days, have migrated to Australia, so whenever I go to Australia, it's old journalist week in Australia. A lot of my old colleagues in school and college have also been settled in Australia, so it's always waving the old school flag when you get back to Australia. So in that sense, I've been quite comfortable in Australia over the years, but then traveling around with my daughter, I began seeing a different side of Australia. And as all of you know, my main interest is heritage. And this is something which fascinated me about Australia, for a country which, as far as I'm concerned, has no heritage. Australia's heritage begins from 1788, January 26th, same as our Republic Day. And effectively, that's modern Australian heritage. And in 225 years, they're able to sell heritage far more than we are able to sell it in India, and do a much better job. And they sell the slightest of things. One little thing which I remember is the stretch of 1 mile stretch, which they call the crooked mile, which was the crooked track the gold miners used to take in one little village. And over the years, that crooked mile got little buildings and hotels and shops and all set up. And those still remain, and that's what's being sold as heritage. And I spent a whole day there following the crooked mile. And this is the kind of thing I began to look at in Australia, because this heritage aspect of it, which they have in very many places, is certainly fascinating. Young heritage in many ways for us, but still a fascinating trail. And that's what I began to put down in books. Then when recently, I think it was 2011, I've written some artists together. And so the articles and all have been put together in this book, together with the snippets which have appeared in the, and it gives you a fairly wide-ranging introduction to Australia. I then added a postscript, which I think is very important considering the present relationship, is on the Australian educational system. I have a very good friend in Australia who teaches in Orange, New South Wales, at the New South Wales University. And I spend a lot of time with him whenever I go to Australia. And since I've long been interested in education, I've taught quite a bit. I've been looking at the Australian education system and I'm very, very impressed with it as such. I've had experience of the British system, I've had experience of the American system, and in many ways I found this a much better system than either the British or the American system. It's a much more hard-working system than I found, going from high school, from school days into college as such. There's a lot more individuality given for students to work together separately rather than wait and be fed, spoon-fed, as many of our systems do. And so that takes up the chapter here. The issue when looking at this book, really, this was at the time just after when I put all this together, was just after the incidents in Melbourne, when there was a big hue and cry about racism in Australia. Now, I'm not saying that there's no racism in Australia, but I've always looked at from the time I went to the States in 1946, and that's a hell of a long time ago, to today, whether you look at the glass half full or the glass half empty. And fortunately for me, I've always looked at the glass half full. And touch wood, me nor my family nor anybody connected with us ever had, and I have it. My Sambandhis have been there for the last 50 years or 55 years, and they've never had any experience of racism. So there are incidents, there will be, but certainly in terms of education, especially on the big campuses and all, I don't think there's going to be that. And I think some of that comes through also in the book as such. What David is going to do with this book, I don't know, but certainly it's something which people interested in Australia will find an interesting read. It's also a book which people going to Australia, they're getting into or wanting to stick only to college as such and not move out and look at things, will help them see that there's much more to Australia than just sitting at your work desk or your school desk or your college desk. There is much more really in many, many ways and enjoyable ways, and I think that comes across in this book in many ways. I hope that purpose will be served with the consulate widely distributing it over the years to come. And I think it should go beyond the Madras Consulate Generals to the other Consulate General's office also. Okay, thank you all very much.